Hey everybody, it's Erin from the Impatient Gardener, and today I have an exciting collaboration with a fabulous YouTuber in England. Alexandra from the Middle Sized Garden has a wonderful channel with amazing advice on it and beautiful pictures of gardens, and she has the wonderful opportunity to talk to so many great gardeners. And so it's very fun to team up with her on a little video for you about winter tip. So interestingly enough, Alexandra and I have gardens that aren't completely dissimilar to one another, and in fact we grow many of the same plants, but we are gardening in extremely different climates. Alexandra's garden actually is in a very warm part of England. It falls kind of in what would be maybe like a zone 8B or a 9. And here, of course, I garden in a 5B. And so we thought it would be kind of fun to share with you some winter tips for things you should be doing in your garden and things you shouldn't be doing in your garden, that you can kind of choose what fits your area better depending on where you're located. Because even though we're all dealing with the same plants, what Alexandra can and should be doing in her garden in winter is much different from what you can and should be doing in your garden in winter here in Zone 5. In addition to Alexandra's tips being good for you if you're in a slightly warmer zone, they're also good for you if you're in a colder zone. Just consider these either fall or late winter spring tips when we're doing these kinds of things in our garden. So I thought I'd cover some things you should be doing in your garden. And stay tuned, because Alexandra's going to pop in with her tips for things you should be doing. She's doing in her garden in winter that you should consider doing as well if you're slightly warmer. Or again, adapt those tips if you're in a colder zone.
Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middle Sized Garden YouTube channel in Kent, southeast England, where we are very roughly a zone 9. In the winter we don't often get snow, perhaps 1 year in 4 in the time I've lived here, and we also have relatively few frosts. The middle-sized garden is a walled town garden, and it's about 100 foot long, and it's in an L shape, so it's about 80 foot wide at its widest and 40 foot wide nearer the house. And I grow roses, lavender, salvias, hydrangeas, dahlias. I love dahlias. And I've noticed that some of the gardening jobs we do in winter make such a difference to our gardens in the summer. And the first one of those is to feed your soil. I put a layer of about 2 to 3 inches of garden mulch or compost on top of my soil in all my borders, and I don't dig it in, but I just let the worms and the microorganisms dig it in. But that really gives the garden a flying start for next season. The nutrients don't wash away because it's not a fertiliser, it's feeding the soil, and it just slowly integrates over the next 3 months. So when you come to plant in spring, your soil will be just much richer.
So the first thing you want to do in your winter garden, because a lot of times it's not pleasant to be outside, and B, kind of difficult to be outside in the middle of winter where some of us live. What you want to do is just keep an eye on your shrubs. Check them to make sure that the deer aren't getting after them if you struggle with that, as you all know that I do. Keep an eye on the weather. If it looks like you're going to get extremely cold weather, you might want to take some extra measures to protect your plants. So for instance, last year we had the polar vortex come, and it was incredibly cold here, far colder than our zone 5 would indicate it should have been. So what you can do if you see that coming is get out there, and if you've got newer plants or plants that are questionably zone hardy, get out there and mulch the crown of those trees and shrubs really well. Go find leaves out of your compost pile, or bark mulch, or even some soil if you can find soil. Heck, you could even go buy a bag of potting mix at the store. Whatever you have to do to protect that crown and make sure that crown has a little bit more insulation than it might otherwise have if you've got a big weather event coming. The other thing you can do is you can use burlap to wrap sensitive trees. A lot of times evergreens are very affected by that cold weather, and it's not because they're not root hardy, it's because they are constantly transpiring. They are losing moisture through their needles and through their leaves. So last year we saw a lot of damage in our area on boxwoods, and that's because Not just that it was so cold, but more than that, it was a very cold, very windy area. So in particular, boxwoods that were exposed to wind fared very poorly in our winter last year, and I saw boxwoods everywhere with a great deal of winter damage. So what you can do to protect those, if you see that coming, is you can get out there with burlap, wrap some burlap around them, and provide some protection from the wind.
One job I do throughout the winter, and which lots of people don't, is to mow my lawn. Now that's partly because we have very mild winters, and actually the lawn does grow a bit. But it's also a tip I got from a professional gardener who said that if the lawn is looking neat and the edges are looking neat, then the whole garden will look better, even if there's not much going on there. And professional gardens are mown usually throughout the winter. So in a sense, so should we be. You don't need to mow so often, and you don't need to mow so close. And certainly if it's been raining a lot, don't go out and mow, simply because the mud will get churned up in the grass and it'll wear holes in it.
You know, the other thing that I like to do in winter is I find it a very good time to take stock of my garden. Not only to reflect upon last year's garden, and I often refer back to the photos that I've taken over the year to see what I liked, what I didn't like, what worked, what didn't work, but also to get out in the garden, take a look at it, look out my windows and see where things look good now, because your garden should look good in 4 seasons. You should find something to enjoy in your garden all year long. So this is a really good time to look around and say, hey, it's looking a little bare. Maybe I need to bring in some more evergreens, or maybe I need some shrubs or trees with a really good framework to add some more bones to the garden and offer a little bit more texture in the garden. I save all my gardening magazines, and I will go through those magazines and look for inspiration. And when I look outside and I see, okay, this is an area that needs some work, then I can refer to those magazines and I can say, you know, maybe this is something that I could incorporate into my garden. And for me, the best planning for my garden and thinking for my garden happens in winter. I don't particularly love winter, but I'm very thankful that I have the opportunity to take a little bit of a rest from working in the garden to just think about my garden and make a plan for the following year.
And another job that I really think makes a big difference to do in the winter is to prune your deciduous trees and shrubs, with the exception of cherry trees, which would prefer to be pruned in summer. You can see the branches much more clearly because the leaves are off. The thing to remember about pruning trees and shrubs is that wherever you cut in the branch is where all the next lot of growth will spring from. So you need to decide whether you want an open, airy, graceful shape that follows the natural lines of the tree or shrub, or whether you want a very tightly clipped, very dense, very sculptural shape. And actually, I think it's really great to have both in gardens. If you want a very dense shrub, like for instance topiary, then you clip it all around equally. You decide what the shape's going to be and you clip it, and you may in the early years have to clip it quite often so that it really bulks up. If on the other hand you want an open and graceful look to your tree or shrub, you need to take the branch off as near to the bigger branch or to the main trunk as you can. So for example, with a shrub you might take out 1/3 of the thickest and oldest stems completely from the base. So don't just clip a shrub, reduce it say by about 1/4 because you just want it to be smaller, without thinking first, do I want an open, graceful, arching look, or do I want a really dense, very geometric shaped look? If you kind of just cut all over very roughly, not really taking any notice of where you're cutting the branches, then what you'll get is a kind of congested and slightly distorted shrub. It'll just look sort of lumpy.
And of course, sometimes thinking about gardening and planning for gardening doesn't quite scratch the gardening itch that you have in the middle of winter. That's when seed starting happens for me. I love starting seeds. In addition to growing so many plants that I can fill up my garden with, which I otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to have in my garden. It is hands-on gardening. It is tending to plants, and it does so much good for my soul at that time of year. So I do a fair amount of seed starting in winter, and I probably take it a little bit too far, but you know, you don't have to go to the ends of, I would say start a couple of trays of seeds, get one grow light, start a couple of trays of seeds, just to get your hands in the dirt and get you back in the mode of growing things again. There's tremendous satisfaction that comes from growing a plant from seed all the way through the end of its life, whether it's a vegetable and you're harvesting it, or it's a flower and you're enjoying those flowers, or perhaps you're even saving the seed from those plants for the following year. It is one of the most satisfying things that I do in my garden, although I find it much more interesting in, say, January and February than I do in May when I'm trying to finish off those plants and get them out of my house. So I'm standing on the stump of an enormous ash tree that we had to have taken down last year. Unfortunately, it succumbed to emerald ash borer like all of the other ashes in our yard. But this one was a very large tree, and it was a fixture in this part of the garden, so it was sad to see it go. Of course, that also presents an opportunity. This has always been just sort of a native area. What you're seeing around me are all the seed heads from the native goldenrod that grows here. But this area by the driveway now, without that tree here, looks a little bit wild would be a nice way to put it, and weedy would be probably the more appropriate way to put it. So I've been thinking about and working on a plan for this for next year. And that is one of the big things that you can do in winter, is if you have a new garden idea, not just revamping a bed or taking stock of where you need to add a plant or replace a plant, but truly create a new area of your garden like I'm going to do here. Taking a break to do that in winter when your mind is fresh and everything seems possible is the perfect time to do that. So what I do is I go in here, I will measure all of this so I can map this out on graph paper, and I will go in there and I will try to map out all of the areas, exactly what I'm going to come up with a plant list, I'm going to come up with what goes where, I'm going to come up with a work list, I'm going to come up with a conceptual budget, although it's very hard to know that because you don't really know how much a plant is going to cost. And I'm going to see, can I do this all in one year? Is this a phased in project? How is this going to work? I never used to design gardens that way. I used to go dig up an area and start plunking plants in it. And every time I designed a garden that way or started a garden that way, I have regretted it. And I spent money on plants that I didn't really like or weren't right for the area. Then I felt like I had to keep those plants there, which is not a great feeling. So the past few areas that I've created a new garden in my yard in, I have done this. I have come up with a very specific plan, and it doesn't come naturally to me, but I'm getting better at it. And it is the best thing to do in winter because it really satisfies your urge to garden, even when you can't be out in the garden.
And there's one last job, which I do, usually in the early winter, and which gets me lots of compliments, but also people think it's completely mad, and that is I wash the trunks of my silver birches. They're just silver birch Jack Montii, a very common one, and I take a bowl of water with washing up liquid and a sponge, and I simply sponge the trunks as high as I can reach. And you wouldn't believe how many people come into the garden at all times of year and say, my gosh, your silver birch trunks, they're just lovely and white. What kind of a tree is it? And I say, oh, it's just the standard Jack Montii, but I wash it, whereupon they just fall apart with laughter.
So I hope you found those tips for what you can and should be doing in your garden, regardless of where you live, helpful today. The good news is that there are a lot more tips about what you should not be doing in your garden, and sometimes those are even more important. So head on over to Alexandra's channel, The Middle-Sized Garden. Here is a link to the video right over here, and go check those tips out now.